There is something interesting about a great man who's been exiled to an island. This great man that we're going to talk about today his name is John. John was an apostle of Jesus. He was with Jesus, and he was the last one to leave the scene. John outlived Peter and Paul and all the other original people who were with Jesus. And basically what's happened to John at this point is that he has been exiled, more than likely by the Romans, to the island of Patmos. It's a Greek island, and he is there to be exiled for the rest of his life. Now, when I think about John, one of the things that comes to my mind, what really stands out, is that he was a writer. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He wrote the book of John, and then we've also got 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, followed by Jude and Revelation in the Bible. And it's interesting to note that the book of Revelation was actually written by John. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. John and the book of Revelation and what we can learn from it. So let's get started. I found this interpretation of John. It is basically what he was thinking about while he was stranded on this island of Patmos. This is what he said. He said, "How lonely it is here on the island of Patmos. I'm old and tired and nobody seems to care." The Apostle John sat quietly and he watched the waves in the sea and how they pounded against the rocks on the shore. Thought to himself, he says, "They're like the years that go by. One by one they come and they break against the rocks of time and they're gone. They're just gone." Now, I'm sure that John had spent a lot of his life watching the waves. Being with Jesus, they probably watched the waves together, along with Peter and the rest of the disciples frequently, as much as they traveled on the water and as they walked from village to village and town to town and city to city. They would have watched the waves many times. And John was reflecting as he's sitting there on this island just to think about his life, and he sees those waves and he thinks he sees one wave come in and crash, and then he thinks that's like the years. And you know how on New Year's you feel like the year has just suddenly disappeared, and all of a sudden you find yourself with a new wave, a new year. But that's kind of what life is like. It's like a wave that crashes on the rocks. It's here, but when it's gone, it's gone. And that's significant. After he was thinking about the waves, it says, John thought back over the years of his life. He smiled as he thought about the day that he first began to follow Jesus, and of the happy times he had had with him all over the Sea of Galilee. He thought of all the miracles which he had seen Jesus do, and the sermons which he had heard him preach. What a wonderful day it was when he preached to us on the mountain, Paul thought. I've never heard a sermon like that, and seen all the happy faces and all the people healed. But then John frowned. His mind went back to the night when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He would never forget the sight of the soldiers winding their way up the Mount of Olives with torches, coming to capture Jesus. They crucified him, John shouted. They nailed the Son of God to a cross. But John smiled again as he thought of the wonderful morning when he and Peter reached the empty tomb. Jesus had risen from the dead. John kept thinking of all the things that had happened. He remembered the day Jesus had left the Mount of Olives and had gone back to heaven. He thought about the prayer meetings that the lonely disciples had had together in the upper room. He remembered Peter's great sermon on the day of Pentecost and the thousands who began to follow Jesus because of it. Then Paul came to know Christ, John whispered. He took the gospel everywhere. Now Paul is dead. So are all my other friends. Suddenly, and that's when a great figure stood over John. And this man was Jesus. John fell on his face and he worshiped him. And Jesus told him, he said, "Write what I show you in a book." Then Jesus pulled aside the curtain of the future and showed John the things that no living man had ever seen before. He opened the door of heaven and let John look inside. In the very center of heaven was God's throne. It was just as the tree had been, the tree of life had been in the center of the Garden of Eden. It was the throne of God. John couldn't find words to tell us how beautiful this sight was. He tried to compare heaven with the emeralds and rainbows and the seas of glass as if they were some type of crystal, but these were not beautiful enough to describe it. Okay, so if he tried to compare heaven with the emeralds and the rainbows and the seas as if they were made out of crystal, and these were not beautiful enough to describe heaven, it must have been a fantastic place, wouldn't it? And then John heard the most wonderful singing he had ever heard in his life. As a matter of fact, he never dreamed he'd hear such beautiful singing. Far better than anything he'd ever heard before. Because it was a great choir of angels that were singing a song about Jesus. "Worthy is the Lamb," they sang. "He will get power, riches, wisdom, and honor." Then Jesus showed John that wonderful day when he would come back to earth again. John caught his breath as he saw the dead people raising from the graves. They were raising to meet Jesus. Suddenly John saw a great white throne. Before the throne there were millions and millions of people. What a breathtaking sight! As the people of all time stood before the throne, and a great library of books was opened. One by one, each person's name was called, and the judge of all the earth read a record of that person's life. And after that, he checked in a great book. This great book was called the Book of Life. And if that person's name was not found, in the Book of Life, then he was sent away from God and heaven forever. But those whose names were written in the Book of Life were sent to heaven to live happily ever after with Jesus and his Father. Is that not beautiful? So, what we have here is John looking back over his life. He remembers Jesus and the miracles that he did and the places he went with Jesus. He remembers great men that he was associated with. Great men who changed the course of human history. People like Peter and Paul and the rest of the apostles and disciples. He remembered that, and he remembered what Christ had went through when he died on a cross and when he raised from the dead, And when he descended into the heaven, when he ascended into the heavens, and then he talks about what he saw in heaven. The singing, the beauty, all the wonderful things that were there. But what is heaven? I've thought about it for a while, and I've looked at the Bible and what it says about heaven. But I think that heaven can be described best in just 3 words. There's only 3 words that I think best describe heaven. And those 3 words are home, love, and family. God's family. That's what heaven is. It's a home, it's love, and it's family.